Crazy. All right. So if you remember, we're talking about the thyroid hormone, metabolic rate. We talked about this diagram, which I believe this is the one I gave you, right? Yeah, that's the cold one. So what I was going to have you do with your group, and I guess Alex, maybe you want to go over there with Ross, so y'all can have a group of two since somebody else is there. I know. They were just feeling depressed about the cat, I think. So anyways, you've got 3 questions to answer. Actually, let's do those first. Quick review, and then we'll do the questions. What in the world? Hold on. All right, so you remember those feedback diagrams that we'll keep doing over and over again? There's always a stimulus, a receptor, control center, and an effector. And then the effector, if it's negative feedback, which they basically all are, the effector turns off the stimulus. So if the stimulus is high body temperature, the effector lowers your body temperature. If the stimulus is low body temperature, what do you think the effector does? Raises your body temperature, right? So let's look at how that works for thermoregulation.
Depends on a nervous feedback loop, beginning with thermoreceptors.
Maybe it's a little loud.
A group of neurons in the hypothalamus of the brain functions as the body's thermostat. These neurons in the preoptic region of the hypothalamus integrate signals that come from thermoreceptors throughout the body. In its turn, the temperature control center in the preoptic area stimulates the heat-losing and heat-promoting centers in the hypothalamus.
All right, so let's see what happens with high temperature, which is the one.
When body temperature becomes too high, either under extreme heat stress or during exercise, the control center in the preoptic region inhibits the heat-promoting center and stimulates the heat-losing center. Output signals from the heat-losing center to blood vessels in the skin cause them to dilate. This allows the relatively warm blood to enter the skin in large amounts. The sweat glands in the skin produce perspiration that collects on the surface of the skin. The evaporating sweat cools the skin, which cools the blood that is then recirculated in the body.
All right, so with your group then, for that response to high body temperature, I want to know stimulus, receptor, control center, and effectors. No, I want you to talk to your group about it first. Don't get confused, this is your, wait, which one is this one? Yeah, so this is the cold body temperature loop. That's not the one we're looking at. This is the high body temperature one. So stimulus, receptor, control center, effector. So there's a few different places. One's in the skin, and then also there's some in the hypothalamus that sense whether your body temperature is too high. Where's the control center? That's true as well. So you've got 2 different receptors. You could say skin and hypothalamus. Control center is hypothalamus. What's the effector? So
dilating, and then your blood flow increases and you perspire.
okay, so it's not perspiration, but
The evaporation of it.
but what actually does it?
It's cooling.
The sweat glands. So the effector is the sweat gland. And what makes the blood, more blood to the surface? What does that? Yeah, so what structure then? Yeah, so like the blood vessels, or the blood vessels close to the surface. So an effector is always a body structure. It's not so much the response. Do you know what I mean? You wouldn't say the effector is more blood flow or increased heart rate or something. would always be the heart or the blood vessels. And if you even wanted to extend it, you could always put, maybe it would make more sense if you put a new category of response underneath the effector. That might clear it up. This is always like a body structure.
So you said the blood vessels, or you can say the sweat gland?
Yeah, it would be both.
Okay.
Because both would happen at the same time. And then the response, that'd be what the effector does, like perspiration or more blood flow, something like that. So that's the hot one. And of course, you have access to that link if you want to review it as well. So let's take a look at the cold one.
If body temperature becomes too low, the control center in the preoptic region stimulates the heat-promoting center. Output signals from the heat-promoting center cause muscles to contract in a repetitive cycle called shivering and stimulate the release of hormones that increase tissue metabolism. Additionally, nerve impulses cause blood vessels in the skin to constrict, decreasing the flow of warm blood near the skin's surface, and thereby recirculating warmer blood back to the body's core. The result of the forced heat production and the minimized heat loss in the peripheral parts of the body returns body temperature to normal, and homeostasis is restored.
So that's a little bit of the cold stress, but you've got the full description on this diagram. So I didn't quite include everything. And I'll just point out the shivering one. Why does shivering warm you up? Do what? So how does that make heat?
Because you're using up ATP, which byproduct is heat.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not actually the movement of the muscles or something, which maybe I think that's what I thought at some point.
Friction of my shivering.
It's not like the friction. Yeah, that's what I kind of thought, I think. But yeah, you're exactly right. Just if you're using up ATP, you've got to make more, and that creates heat. So that's interesting. I don't remember the last time I was cold enough to be like shivering.
Oh, it's coming.
Yeah, I know. All right, so with your group, why don't you work on number 2. And make sure for these, like all these questions that are similar, you're describing what problems the person would actually have and why. Oh, and I should tell you, it is about this diagram. So we're talking about their response to, I keep forgetting which this is, to cold. So it's this diagram that you got, the cold response. I think that was it. Oh, let's do a quick, this will be a good review for the exam anyways. All right, so those feedback diagrams, did you feel like that was a little bit hard to do? We're going to keep practicing those, and that means you're really going to have to think critically about them. Actually look at them, and it's going to look confusing at first, but you just take it a little step at a time and say this does this, this does this. What happens if this is crossed out, or this does too much?
Is that going to be on the test?
Yes.
Are we going to get a copy of the?
It depends. Depends on how hard the question is. If I had a really hard question, then you get one of these. If it's an easy question,
Fifth grader, if it's hard for them, and if it isn't.
they're smart. Be careful with that. But the key thing is, I think, is just you're not going to look at those diagrams right away and know the answer. Did you feel like you looked at it and you just knew it? Or did you have to kind of like piece it together? Yeah. And there's nothing wrong with you. I had to piece it together too. Like I write these questions and then I don't really know the answer until I look at the diagram and think about it. It's got to kind of like take it through a couple steps. All right, so quick review then. You should be able to do this without looking at anything, these questions. So how does the body respond to the body temperature rising too high then? All right, so E is right, sweating and vasodilation of blood vessels. What about too low? Bet you all got it right, 80% for F, which is right. Thyroid hormones released and the blood vessels constrict. And you constrict the blood vessels by the skin so that you keep your blood more into the core, because as it gets close to the skin, it loses heat. If you're cold, you don't want to lose any more heat. So that's where hypothermia comes from, because the colder you get, the more vasoconstriction happens and the less blood flow you get to your fingers and your toes. And I guess your nose, right? Where else do you get frostbite usually? Your ears, fingers, toes. Yeah, your extremities basically. And I guess your nose is probably just because it's like so exposed and sticking out. And I don't think there's that much blood flow there anyways to start with. To the skin, you know. It's crazy. All right, so you did all that. So let's do some exam review. So why don't we do 25 part 2 since we were just talking about it, and then we'll go back to 23. So anyone who want answers to on that section?
I just have a question.
Yes.
On K, explain
The last.
how production is directly linked to the metabolic rate. Could we kind of go back to the group thing we just did with the thyroid? Could you explain it like that?
Yeah,
I mean,
so
your metabolic rate, so.
well, you could almost explain it. So
It would take longer to heat up because you're losing one of your effectors.
That's part of it, but basically basically what that's saying is why does when your metabolic rate go up, your heat production go up? What do you mean? Well, maybe I should ask you, what's metabolic rate? What is that a measure of? How fast? What?
Your chemical reaction.
And specifically how fast you're breaking down glucose to make. Okay. So if you're breaking down glucose faster because your metabolic rate goes up, why does your heat production go up?
It's a byproduct of ATP production.
Yeah, because 40% of that energy in glucose becomes heat when you break it down. That's why it's directly linked. You can't increase your metabolic rate to make more ATP without increasing heat production as a side effect. There's no way to break them in half. If you're making ATP, you're creating heat when you're breaking down glucose. When you're making ATP, so metabolic rate going up means you're breaking down more glucose to make ATP, which means you're making heat when you're breaking down glucose. Which, as a few group mentioned, that's why if your thyroid hormone is removed, your metabolic rate goes down, you're breaking down glucose slower, which means you're probably going to gain weight and be colder if you're in a cold environment. Discuss the significance of cholesterol to disease. Sure, do you remember what's the bad cholesterol? Okay, so if you have high levels of LDL, it gets deposited in the arteries and can cause plaques that contribute to heart attacks and strokes. And keeping it pretty simple on that one, in patho we're going to go into more detail of how that happens. But diet and liver are the two sources of cholesterol. So for H, basically that's this diagram you did and all these questions. And I think the key thing to think about is you could probably kind of puzzle through it. Is it about storing energy? Which state is it if you're like storing something for later? It's probably the absorptive state. If it's anything about breaking things down, it's probably the post-absorptive state. So I think it's probably easier to think about it that way than try to memorize all 12 of those statements that you answered. So just kind of think about the idea of it, and then you can probably figure out anything I'd write. Oh, we'll go back to 23. You're all good for 25? Part 2? All right, so let's go back to the beginning. 23, part 1. Yeah, so the mucociliary escalator consists of 2 main things, right? You have the goblet cells, which produce mucus, and that traps foreign particles. And then, what's the second part of it? Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah, exactly. So you've got the cilia throughout the respiratory tract, moving it upwards. The mucus, and so you can create loogie. There you go. So it's basically right in the name there. Muco for mucus, ciliary for cilia. So you just kind of think about what those 2 things do. And you probably have it. And I think it's important. I don't think most people realize that you're making mucus way down here, down into the lungs even. I think we generally think it's just made in the sinuses. Is that kind of what you'll tend to think? I don't know. I feel like that's sort of the general idea that people would have.
Until you start listening to lung sounds.
Here's some mucus in there. Where things are going. Like Hillary, she's got some mucus in her lungs right now.
I have some infected mucus.
She has pneumonia. Pneumonia. And Trump's going to be on Dr. Oz for Dr. Oz to tell him he's overweight today.
I saw something
That's
that had
funny.
like a picture of Obama.
Hillary's probably overweight too. Don't you think? You don't think so? I don't know. I bet she is. Oh, does the BMI thing for overweight, does that change based on age, or is it like once you're an adult? It's just height and weight, right?
And they don't factor in muscle or anything.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's not always the best measure.
No.
That should be something I think looked at and possibly recalculated.
Treat the patient, not the number.
There you go. That sounds like a good one. All right, anyways. Enough about our candidates' health problems. You heard of Henry Harrison got pneumonia and died a month after he was not nominated, what's it called? Sworn into office. He got pneumonia the day he gave his speech outside. And he died in a month. Yeah, I know. He talked for 2 hours, apparently. Anything else? Oh, did y'all get to change I there? Did I tell you that at some point?
Yeah.
All right, so everybody has it fixed? All right. What about 23 part 2 then? Should we actually get to doing those in class? D? Yeah, let's see. I've got a few pictures from the PowerPoint for one of those. All right, so the first one, high altitude. What do you think for that one? Yeah, and if you remember, let's see, didn't we do where's that feedback diagram? So it says reduces the rate of gas exchange. So you said there's less oxygen in the air. So that means less oxygen gets into the blood when you breathe it in. So what do you think happens to your breathing rate at higher altitudes? Right? Because that's that controlled respiration feedback one. If there's less oxygen in the air, you end up with less oxygen in your blood, which is the stimulus to turn on faster and deeper breathing.
That's why you use purple mountain climb.
Yeah, so if you're going up to 25,000 feet, It's going to be tough. And I don't know if you know, for watch this Everest movie. So in order to acclimate to not use oxygen, they basically, sleep up high, but then multiple times before they try to get to the very top, they'll hike up 2,000 feet, spend the night, go back down to chill out for a while, and then go hike up there again and stay for 3 nights, higher up, go back down, to get the body to make more red blood cells and get used to the altitude. So they'll be there for like 3 or 4 weeks. When it's, if you tried to hike it straight from the bottom to the top, it'd only take you like 4 days or something. And the Sherpas actually have genetic mutations that help them function better at high altitudes. I think their hemoglobin's different or something. I can't remember exactly what it was. They just studied it a couple years ago. Yeah, I guess we should finish D though. So, pulmonary edema. Can't believe they didn't tell me that we didn't finish this. So pulmonary edema is basically getting fluid in your alveoli, like fluid buildup, from low blood flow, like heart disease, heart failure, that kind of thing. And so here's normal. If you remember your alveoli, they're supposed to just fill up with air. So you can have oxygen go in, CO2 go out of the blood. But if you end up with fluid in here, what do you think that's going to do to this whole process?
Decrease the surface area.
It's not so much the decreased surface area as the distance it has to go. Because remember what kind of cells are in there? What shape? It's not cuboidal.
Oh, columnar. No?
Not an alveoli. It's what? Transitional now. It's simple squamous. So I think somebody said squamous, somebody said simple. Put them together. So you're only supposed to have to go this far. This little distance. That's normal. But if you end up with pulmonary edema and that whole half the alveoli is full of water, like that, now how far does it have to go? It has to travel all the way through here to diffuse. And the farther it has to diffuse, the longer it'll take, and the less oxygen actually gets into your blood. And this would be edema. This is the alveoli. And then up here is the blood going past. So this O2, I'm going to put it closer. And here it only has to go such a short distance. Does that kind of make sense? Yeah, the oxygen and CO2 have to diffuse a farther distance, which makes it less efficient. All right. Emphysema. What's the number one cause of emphysema? So that's from smoking and breathing in all those like toxic chemicals, etc. It actually breaks the alveoli down, and they end up just going away basically. And you'll start getting, instead of these nice tiny little grape sacs, you'll end up with basically big holes. So instead of a big cluster of grapes, you end up with just one big circle, which is less surface area then for volume. And if you have less surface area, then you're going to have less diffusion or slower diffusion. Diffusion, because there's less area for it to happen in, which is why what's one of the main treatments for emphysema? How do you usually know someone's has emphysema? What do you see? Yeah, so I was kind of all the time, but once it gets bad, you just have to. Oh, what is oxygen? Why would oxygen help then? What do you think? Right. So instead of breathing in the normal amount, you breathe in extra, you can overcome this low surface area and still get enough oxygen into your blood. The oxygen, yeah, it's a little flammable. And I guess the same thing for like babies, putting them on oxygen if they're premature, have some issues. You could just overcome that problem by just giving them extra oxygen until they develop fully or the problem's fixed. All right. So somebody's asking me about another one. Oh. Where I want to go. I think I passed this one out. So I think you probably have this on an assignment somewhere.
We didn't do video.
Uh-oh. Why didn't y'all tell me? So very similar to all the other feedback ones we've looked at. So you've got your stimulus, which is low oxygen or high CO2, detected by receptors in the medulla, which is in the brain, or receptors in the arteries. That's the receptor part. Control centers in the medulla oblongata. And of course, if you have low oxygen, what do you need to do? You just need to breathe faster or breathe deeper. So the effectors are the muscles that control breathing. And then the response is increased oxygen, lowered CO2 in the blood. And so for that one, if it was on the test, it'd either be ask you how this works somehow, or give you the diagram and asks you what happens if this part's broken or overactive or something. And the same thing for the body heat ones. Either I'll just ask you how it works, or give you the diagram and ask you about what happens if this part does this instead or something. And I guess one thing to remember, if you just write something sort of vague like the effectors don't respond to the control center anymore or something, that's not going to get you all your points. You've got to bring it to the whole person level. Too bad?
The receptor.
Yeah, you've got receptors in 2 places. And you have this, obviously you have that PowerPoint, and then that's from your book too, so. And there's probably, let's see. And if you want practice with that too, that's on here. Somebody can talk you through the feedback of breathing if you go to that one. Anything else for 23 part 2? I think we did almost everything. All right, what about 24? Explain how the body ensures that food is properly digested. Any ideas? Yeah, so you're right. So there's 2 main things. That's the first one. The pyloric sphincter is very small. So anything that's large can't get through there. Does anyone remember the second one? It does? Yeah, how does it regulate the slowly? Like, how come your stomach just doesn't push it all through? Sort of. What happens at the duodenum? Yeah, let me go to that. Yeah, let's go to that video real fast, because I think that's the best way to show it. What's up, part 1? I'll show you that little video, if I remember it. Enterogastric reflex. Should we watch the defecation reflex again, too?
As more and more chyme leaves the stomach, distension of stretch receptors in the duodenum triggers the enterogastric reflex. The enterogastric reflex has many functions. It inhibits excessive amounts of chyme from entering the duodenum. It reduces intestinal cell erosion by limiting inflow of gastric acid. And it increases the duration of the digestion of chyme. This occurs in preparation for the movement of chyme into the small intestine. The motor impulses in the enterogastric reflex are sympathetic.
All right. So anyways, first part is the sphincter is not very big. So only small things can get through. Second part is, like you said, only a little bit of chyme goes into into the duodenum at a time, which is the enterogastric reflex. What do you think the stimulus was? Chyme going where? Okay, so and then where's the receptor? No, you'd think so.
Be the endogastric reflex.
This whole thing is enterogastric reflex, which I should put up here.
Stretch receptors
Where?
in the duodenum.
Right. So if chyme comes in through duodenum, it stretches it. Those receptors are turned on. Control center is still some neurons down there. Doesn't really matter. What's the effector?
Pyloric sphincter.
And then what's the response? What does the pyloric sphincter do? It opens or
Closed to keep too much from entering.
closes? So basically, whenever there's stuff in the duodenum that are stretching it out, this is activated, the sphincter's closed. Pyloric sphincter's closed. So that way, the food, the chyme stays in the stomach and it does its rich repulsion, gets all mixed around, and it has time to get more digested. You just squirt in a little at a time. So as soon as this chyme leaves the duodenum, then that stimulus goes away and the sphincter opens. Chyme goes in, stimulus activated, sphincter closes. That's kind of how that works. All right, what else? Retropulsion is the chyme moving back in the wrong direction of digestion, basically. So it's not like, the food you digest makes a direct path through the stomach to the small intestine. It gets retropulsioned around and around by the stomach. I'm kind of curious. Does anyone know if you listen to bowel sounds, if you can actually tell what part you're listening to? Like if it's the stomach doing retropulsion, or you could hear like if there's extra air in certain places too.
That's how you can tell if you have obstruction.
What does it sound like if you have an obstruction?
You don't hear that sound.
Oh, really? It's just like,
Ceases.
interesting.
So you have to do a GI assessment every day on people. So you just
Uh-huh.
really listen to all four quadrants. You're not really listening specifically for what sound it's making.
Just that there's
that it's
stuff
moving. If
going
not,
around.
Bust out the milk of mag.
The milk of magnesia.
Let me give you a brown cow. Throw it in some prune juice.
Oh, prune juice. It's crazy. All right, so then part 2 for 24. Which one? E. Oh, discuss the feedback. Y'all really want to know about these feedback mechanisms? There sure are a lot of them. Did we at least do that assignment?
What is the question? Or what is
The feedback mechanism for the pH and peristalsis. See if I can find it. Yeah. Wait, this is that. So that's this one. And hopefully now that you've looked at so many of them, you're starting to get a little bit easier because it's always the same kind of logic. It's just slightly different stuff in the receptor, control center, response area. So for this one, there's 2 stimuluses. there's either high pH of gastric juice, which is basic, more basic. Remember, high pH, more basic, confusing in that way. Or the stomach stretching. And then you've got receptors, two kinds, either the chemoreceptor detecting the high pH or the stretch receptor detecting the stretching. Control center, that's just a cluster of neurons there. And then the effectors, the parietal cells make more HCl to lower the pH, and the smooth muscle contracts harder and faster because there's food in there. So you want to squeeze it and move it around quicker to help it digest, that mechanical digestion. So the response lowers the pH and increased mixing. So the digestion should happen faster. So probably a good way to study for all these feedback diagrams is make yourself a little table and just make sure you can memorize each of them. And it doesn't have to be long. Like, look how short this is, right? It's not like I'm writing paragraphs for each little step. Because once you kind of know it, you don't need to write the whole sentence. You can just write a word or two, and you kind of know the rest of it. Like, you could expand on it. So the path, that is this one. So anything you absorb goes through the portal vein to the liver, basically. And then it goes to the vena cava, to the right atrium. So you probably don't need to know all those. So the path it takes, it gets absorbed, it goes to the portal vein, goes to the liver, goes to the hepatic vein, and the vena cava, and the heart. Which means all those nutrients go to the liver first to get processed and looked at. And toxins too. Or alcohol goes to the liver. What else? Yeah. So for G, it's that table that's on the slideshow, or the table in the book. The functions of the hormone, or the enzymes. So like lipases break down lipids, et cetera, et cetera. H. Yeah, so that one. Basically, you just look back at the slideshow. It's got gastrin, stimulus and response. You've got, I guess you already did that one. And then we've got the other two up there too. Yeah, so they're all on there. And if you notice, it doesn't say, for those, it doesn't say know the whole feedback diagram or something, just those specific things. So you need to know a little less about those than like the regulating the pH and peristalsis ones. And one little trick, the response is always going to decrease the stimulus. So that could kind of help you remember it too. So like this one, if the stimulus is low pH, what's the response? Increase the pH somehow. So maybe you remember, put weak base secreted by the pancreas or something. We only have 5 minutes. What about 25 part 1? For part, 25 still, or 24? Back to 25, I just want to make sure. 25 part 1, so we didn't do part 1 yet. I think she's talking about F on part 1. Are you talking about F on 25? All right, so ATP synthase, including what reaction it catalyzes and where it gets its energy from. So if you remember our acting thing, where did ATP synthase get its energy from directly? What? Not quite, that's the electron transport chain. It got it from H pluses, moving from high to low. Who was our great ATP synthase? I don't remember.
Marty.
Yeah. And then what reaction does it catalyze? She was turning and doing something. What was she doing?
Oh, she was releasing the H. No.
H pluses were making her spin to do something.
To smash the ADP to the P.
ADP plus P to ATP. That's the reaction. So adding a phosphate to ADP.
That's what you want?
That's the reaction. That's the reaction that happens. So a little trick, anytime somebody's asking about reactions or something, you should always see this arrow, like something, here's the reactants, there's the product.
On your test, like, let's just say that was your question.
Uh-huh,
Describe ATP synthesis, including what reaction.
uh-huh.
Would you just want us to put that?
Well, that'd be,
Like,
well, it depends.
The whole ATP.
If all it said was identify what reaction it catalyzes,
Just put that.
you'd write that. If I ask you where it gets its energy from,
Right.
then you tell me the other one.
The what?
Then you tell me that H plus is going from high to low,
Okay.
It's like water flowing through it.
right? And D, I don't think we need to go over them. You have that from your groups. I know that whatever they had that you wrote down, that table, you have it. So study that. Don't go back and start from square one or something and read about glycolysis for an hour. We've already simplified it. You did that whole table. You have it. And if you weren't here, you lost it, ask somebody else. Ask somebody in the class. They have it. The role of oxygen. So electrons come to the electron transport chain. They lose their energy, and then they combine with oxygen. The electrons combine with oxygen, hydrogen to make water. So oxygen's the final electron acceptor at the end of the electron transport chain. Yeah, so those electrons in the electron transport chain, you have to do something with them after you use them. So you give them to oxygen and then take hydrogen and make water out of it. All right, so for studying, best thing you can do, read over this once or twice, and then print yourself a blank study guide and find out what you already know. Like, try to write it down without looking at anything. Circle the ones you're still confused about, and then quiz yourself on those till you get That's basically the way to do it. What I don't want you to do, is you've got note cards and stuff, don't keep quizzing yourself on words you already know. Because you know them. Spend your time on the harder stuff that you haven't figured out yet. You're still kind of hazy on. And you'll be fine. If you have any questions, when's our test then? Not till Tuesday, right? It's next time we meet. So Monday, lots of office hours. You can email me over the weekend if you get stuck on something. Do you know how many emails I get for help with tests? Like one a week. It's not a problem. I want you to ask me questions.